Kia ora, g'day, and good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's session on distributed energy resources. I'm pretty sure it's an American expression, not to sweat the small stuff. But this session is all about taking the small stuff in energy seriously. What do I mean by the small stuff? I'm talking not only rooftop solar, smart appliances, distributed batteries, batteries on wheels, otherwise known as electric vehicles, and everything that's usually behind the meter or otherwise in a distribution network. So distributed energy resources are the supply, the flexible demand, and the storage, usually behind the meter. So we'll be using the term DER to imply all of those different types of distributed energy resources this afternoon. So to rapidly reduce emissions, to ensure that we keep some sort of safe climate, we're going to need everything, everywhere, all at once. And our discussion this afternoon is going to be a lot around how DER has been underestimated as a significant component to all of the solutions that we need. So the panel this afternoon is going to examine DER from 3 geographic perspectives. I'm going to start. Now that people are seated, I can introduce myself. My name is Gabrielle Kuiper. Until recently, I was working with IEEFA, but speaking today on behalf of the Smart Energy Council in Australia. So I'm going to give you an Australian perspective. Then we have a joint presentation from Puerto Rico, which has already come up in the previous session. So Cathy Kunkel, recently also with IEEFA, now with Cambio PR, and not-for-profit focusing on sustainability, and Agustín Irizarry, who's a professor at University de Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. I hope I pronounced that correctly, and he's a professor in energy systems. And then Vinay, Pabba, who's the COO of Vibrant Energy, who's overseen over 3 gigawatts of solar and wind, will speak about his experience, particularly rooftop solar and EVs from an Indian perspective. So I won't spend any more time on the bios. You can all use LinkedIn competently, I'm sure, and want to save as much time as possible for questions. So this session will run the same as the last one. We'll have 3 presentations, one of them joint, and then we'll hopefully have a lot of time for Q&A with the audience. So we will leave all the questions to the end, but don't forget them. If something strikes you that you're passionately want to know the answer to, bear that in mind or write it down, and we'll hopefully have lots of time for discussion in the end. So I'm going to begin by giving you the case for taking the small stuff seriously. Talk about what Australia's been doing well, and also what you all can learn from our mistakes. To start with perhaps the most obvious point, rooftop solar makes use of a pre-existing underutilised asset. It takes a roof and turns it into the location for an electricity generator. So Australia already has 3 million households that have installed solar on their roofs. It's currently 3 gigawatts per year that Australian households are paying to install on their roofs, and also there's a large amount of commercial and industrial rooftop solar that's being installed. Rooftop on households had the leap with existing subsidies, and then commercial and industrial solar has been taking off the last sort of 2 or 3 years, particularly as in the case elsewhere with rising electricity prices. The technical potential for rooftop solar in Australia alone is 180 gigawatts, and our market operator, AEMO, is suggesting that less than a third of that, only 69 gigawatts, will be deployed by 2050. So distributed modular technologies like solar and wind and battery storage avoid the pitfalls of mega projects identified by the Danish social scientist Bent Fluvier. Now, obviously, this applies at utility scale as well as at the small scale, but utility scale still depends on large-scale transmission, which can be a mega project with all of the associated risk. And pumped hydro storage and, of course, hydro itself can often be a case where you have a mega project where the risks mean that the costs blow out and the benefits are not realised to the extent originally planned. We currently, this is just a little aside, but we have a large pumped hydro project being built in the Snowy Mountains in Australia. It's in a National Heritage listed area. It's a large mega project, and the tunnel boring machine is currently stuck down a cave. These are just some of the challenges with mega projects that distributed projects can avoid. They also have the opportunity to iterate quickly, which Fluvier points out is a major advantage. So rooftop solar technology and, of course, batteries and everything else, the technology is improving all the time, not only in efficiency, but also coming down the cost curve. Resilience, as we heard in the last session, is absolutely vital for the 21st century. And basically, the previous panel already gave the case that I was going to spell out to you here about how distributed energy resources not only are more climate resilient, but also more resilient to cost increases that we know and price shocks that are associated with dependence on fossil fuels. So Western Power, which is the network operator for Perth and the southwest of Western Australia, has the most forward-looking plan I've ever seen of any network business. They are currently installing standalone power systems and microgrids in remote and regional Western Australia, and they are decommissioning the electricity lines that used to flow to those towns and farms. They've recognised that it's far more cost effective to have a distributed approach, especially when you've got low population density, and also, of course, it makes it more resilient. So that's a very, very brief, high-level summary of the why of distributed energy resources. I'm now going to give you a very high-level overview of the how. Simplistic, but I see it as being in 3 dimensions. You need technical, regulatory, and market integration of distributed energy resources. And you need to do them roughly in that order, albeit overlapping. In Australia, we have seen an enormous amount of technical scaremongering about rooftop solar. So rooftop solar was going to cause massive issues for the grid. You name the technical issue, rooftop solar was going to make it worse or cause it. And basically all of that has been shown to be unfounded. In fact, the opportunity has been far greater than anyone's possibly anticipated. So when rooftop solar started exporting to the grid, households, which now on average are installing 7 or 8 kilowatts, have been restricted in their exports to 5 kilowatts. The biggest innovation from a technical perspective that we've seen is the idea of these dynamic operating envelopes or flexible exports. So this is where you have the network operator sending the signal every between 1 and 5 minutes to every meter in every household, telling them what's the capacity to export, and there's also the potential to do that in terms of limiting or increasing imports as well. So in South Australia, where this is the most advanced, they've found that they can increase that 5 kilowatt limit to 10 kilowatts 98% of the time. So there's only 50 hours a year in the South Australian spring where they need to restrict that export limit less than 10 kilowatts. So that technical innovation means that all of those households with larger solar systems are obviously earning more revenue from their exports. And there's been no need for massive capex investment, as was first speculated. It was going to cost billions of dollars to incorporate all this solar into the grid. That's turned out to be totally unnecessary. What has been necessary is, unsurprisingly, to change the regulation. So because the national electricity market rules were written in Australia prior to rooftop solar becoming a significant part of the supply, there was nothing in the rules that said that the distribution network businesses had to incorporate these behind-the-meter distributed energy resources into the grid. That regulation was just put in place last year, and so that's seen now as a core responsibility, and all of the distribution network businesses are expanding their expertise in this area. I'm hoping I don't need to explain virtual power plants to anyone in this audience, but in case you haven't heard of it, it's where you incorporate a whole lot of these distributed energy resources behind the meter through smart technology, through smart software essentially, into a coordinated power plant acting in concert. In Australia, this is participating in the wholesale markets and also our frequency control and ancillary services markets. So I looked at drafted a report for IEEFA, which looked at what had happened with following various subsidised trials with virtual power plants in Australia. And there's now over 20 commercially available offers for households. But when you look at the margins, that looks like the margins are quite thin. So why are there so many offers in the market? It's obvious, really, when you start to think about it. The utility supplied electricity to people's homes and businesses is declining. The generation and storage behind the meter is increasing. So the retailers and other third parties have realised that the only way that retail will be profitable going into the future is that if they have access to a large fleet of distributed energy resources that they can use to participate in these virtual power plants. The next stage is for virtual power plants to be able to provide local network services. And if people have questions in question time, I'd love to go into this in more detail, but there are two models currently being trialled. One is a local platform. People might have been familiar from the New York REV model, the idea that you have a distributed platform that sits below whatever your market level platform is, and you do local coordinated trading through a platform. The other model that's being trialled, which is very, very interesting, is just simply to use real-time dynamic network pricing. Before I finish, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that electric vehicles are very expensive forms of decarbonisation and expensive cars, but they're very cheap household or business storage. You can get a $50,000 car, it's probably got $40,000 worth of energy storage into it. And while we don't want to replace every gas car with an electric car, if all the electric cars that we do create in the system are a huge opportunity for very cheap, flexible, mobile, distributed storage. And in fact, our Australian energy market operator is forecasting that by 2050, of all the flexible, dispatchable storage in the system, 3/4 of that will be behind the meter. So a large amount of that is going to be electric vehicles, not simply passenger cars, but also obviously fleet vehicles, trucks, buses and the like. So a final observation is that in Australia at least, rooftop solar is actually eating utility scale solar's lunch. You can see that here in the couple of figures. The larger pale yellow is rooftop solar compared to utility scale solar. And because this is a finance conference, the important thing to note here is that Australian households have spent currently $15 billion of their own money on that rooftop solar. So one of the key advantages that we might want to discuss is the fact that all of these distributed energy resources are resources that people are prepared to put their own private capital into, but can be utilised for public benefit. However, in Australia, it's not all sunshine, and there have been some things that we could have done a lot better. First and foremost, that's really getting up to speed with planning for the advent of all of these distributed energy resources and making sure our energy market institutions, whether that's the market operator or the regulators, really have the expertise to plan and manage well for all the DER. I mentioned at the beginning, technical integration is vital, and you need to have the processes, particularly to put in place technical standards very quickly and iterate on that. And then on market integration, making sure that all of the DER can participate on an equal footing in all of the available markets compared with the large-scale resources. So I hope I've set out the case that the small stuff does stack up, and in fact, rooftop solar has been a relatively small investment compared to the coming investment in electric vehicles. And so we need to make sure that we're planning and financing and putting everything in place to make the most of these resources that consumers are prepared to pay for, but can speed up the pace of decarbonisation. That's me. I am now going to hand over to Cathy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Cathy Kunkel with Cambio Puerto Rico, here with Agustín Irizarry to talk about opportunities for distributed energy resources, particularly rooftop solar in Puerto Rico, and also to report on a study of electric vehicle integration into Puerto Rico's grid. So I'm just going to first give some context for Puerto Rico's electrical system. The grid in Puerto Rico, for those who don't follow this, is fragile and more poorly managed than ever, and that was recently illustrated a month ago when Hurricane Fiona passed over Puerto Rico. It was a weak hurricane, Category 1, that hit the southwestern coast of Puerto Rico, yet somehow managed to provoke an island-wide blackout. And it's important to compare that to what has happened in other storms that have passed Puerto Rico previously. 5 years ago, Hurricane Irma, which was a much stronger storm, Category 5, knocked out a lot of power in Puerto Rico, but 60% of power restoration occurred within 2.5 days. After Hurricane Fiona, 60% of power restoration took 8 days, and a month later, there are still people in Puerto Rico without power. In 1996, a hurricane very similar to Fiona, Category 1 with a similar trajectory, hit Puerto Rico, Hurricane Hortense. In that case, there was 100% power restoration within 6 days. So you can see the market deterioration of the grid since then. Even prior to Hurricane Maria, which resulted in the longest power blackout in history 5 years ago, Puerto Rico's grid had suffered from chronic underinvestment and lack of maintenance. Since Hurricane Maria, only about $40 million of the Federal Emergency Management Agency funds that were allocated have actually been spent, of more than $12 billion that were allocated. And the Puerto Rico government's main response to Hurricane Maria 5 years ago was to privatize the electrical grid, and the introduction of a new private operator last year, Luma Energy, has resulted in even worse service due to their lack of experience and lack of staffing. So All of those problems with the grid, the lack of resiliency, the lack of reliability, coupled with rates that are now above 28 cents per kilowatt hour, has meant that Puerto Ricans are rapidly moving towards rooftop solar and storage. As of August of this year, there are 54,000 grid-connected rooftop solar systems in Puerto Rico that provide 370 megawatts of power, which is the size of a power plant. More than 80% of those systems were installed in the last 5 years since Hurricane Maria, and the vast majority of those systems include batteries for resiliency in the face of hurricanes and other blackouts. Similar to Australia, I just learned, rooftop solar generates more electricity in Puerto Rico than utility scale solar. And that has been done with essentially no government support. None of the Federal Emergency Management Agency funds for grid reconstruction have gone to rooftop solar and storage. And although the Puerto Rican government talks a good talk about renewable energy, the actual investment so far has gone into natural gas projects, the conversion of one of the power plants in San Juan to natural gas, and the recent announcement of a new natural gas plant. It's also worth mentioning that Puerto Ricans are not eligible for the federal income tax credit that is available in the rest of the United States for residential or for rooftop solar. And so the only policy support for rooftop solar in Puerto Rico is net metering. Last year, Cambio and IEEFA published the results of a grid modeling study based on Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority data that showed exactly how Puerto Rico's grid could be transformed with rooftop solar and storage, achieving 75% distributed energy within 15 years. And in terms of all of the problems that currently plague Puerto Rico's grid, this would be indeed a real transformation to achieve stable and lower electric rates, resiliency by providing rooftop solar and storage to every home in Puerto Rico, as well as a dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions and reduction in the cost of importing fossil fuels to Puerto Rico. And so I'm going to pass it over to Agustín to talk about the results of a forthcoming modeling study that also looks at how a distributed grid, a decentralized grid, could better support electric vehicle integration. So electric vehicles are currently a small percentage of new vehicle sales in Puerto Rico, but rapidly growing. And the challenges for electric vehicle integration include both charging infrastructure, but also the fragility and the ability of the distribution system to handle new charging loads. So the distribution system modeling study that we're going to report on, which is going to be forthcoming, investigated the performance of distribution feeders under increasing penetrations of electric vehicles under two configurations. One is the current centralized grid, but then comparing that performance to a decentralized grid with 75% renewable energy, rooftop solar and storage resources. So I'll turn it over to Agustín.
Thank you, Cathy. My name is Agustín Irizarry. I'm a professor of electric power systems at the Universidad de Puerto Rico. And first I want to point out, for reasons I don't understand, the logo you're seeing there is Vibrant, which is Kumar's company. We will not charge you for the use of our space. Sorry about that. Now, I'm going to present to you the results of this integration study that we have performed. We did this with Ray Harrell from Wildcat Engineering. Ray is a distribution system engineer. He used our guidance in developing the simulation results you are going to see next. Here we go. Well, as Cathy mentioned, we had done a study before where we compared the centralized fossil fire system and the investment needed to provide resiliency versus providing electricity up to 75% of the energy demand provided by distributed energy resources. So what I'm going to show you here are the results of challenging that even further, saying, what happens if you try to achieve up to 40% of increased demand based on the 2035 scheduled demand or projected demand? If you do this with the existing power grid, versus if you supply 75% of the energy demand at 2035, and then you add on top of that 40% of additional demand that comes from electric vehicles. Okay? And the way we did this was we selected a number of representative electric feeders. As you see in the top graph there, they come from all locations in Puerto Rico, and they're representative as well because they represent urban and rural feeders. They are short, long, and medium in length. Short is less than 5 miles, long is over 20 miles. And they represent all the electric voltages present in the distribution network in Puerto Rico. We simulated this effect on the electric power system, on the distribution system, using a simulation software which is called OpenDSS. OpenDSS is one of the industry standards. One of the problems we face with, when we are working against the government, as we are working here, is that they always have these excuses that are brought up by consultants that want to sell something else. And for instance, we already have a lot of consulting firms operating in Puerto Rico that they also happen to sell fossil fire units. And their solution is always to add a new fossil fire unit. So we needed to use the tools they use in order to show that this is achievable, that this does not represent a threat to the distribution system. So what I'm going to show you next, I'm a professor of electric power systems, so I will restrain myself and not use any equations, but you will be subjected to a number of ugly-looking graphs. So I'm going to try to explain these graphs to you and show you why the distribution energy paradigm is better than the centralized energy. Well, this is the first of the ugly-looking graph. On your left, I guess, is the location of the feeder. This is just a map of the area where the feeder is located. These feeders, this is one of the feeders that I was showing you in that area. This one corresponds to the metropolitan area of San Juan. Now, in this image, you can see the distribution line, and you can see where the transformers are, where the load is connected to the distribution line. And the red arrow points to a specific point on the line. And on this graph on your right, you will see the voltages that correspond to different points along the distribution line. 0 on the left is where the substation is. The substation is where you feed the power into the distribution line, and the substation is connected to the transmission system. As you move away from the substation, you want to have voltages within 5% of the nominal voltage, which are the two bands that you see on top. So 1.05 or 0.95 out of 1, whatever 1 means in the nominal voltage. As you can see, less than 1 mile into the feeder, you already have a violation on the curve that is shown in red. Okay, this is for the existing system. What we want to see is how these voltage violations increase or decrease as we increase the load that comes from electric vehicles. What I'm showing here is the base case on my right, on your left. And you can see we have problems on this red color portion of the line. If we increase the electric vehicle demand by only 20%, you can see that we start having trouble with the voltages on the blue color line in the case of the base case or centralized generation. But if we provide 75% of the energy from distributed energy resources, what you see is an improvement in the performance of the voltage profile of this line. You no longer have problems in the blue portion, and you fix in a significant manner the voltages on the highly loaded red portion of the line. Another item that we monitor while we were doing the simulation is thermal overload. You don't want the conductors of the line to be subjected to more than 100% of the current they can carry. If you overload a distribution line, it overheats, and as it overheats, it may deform permanently or temporarily, and we wanted to avoid that. So another item you want to monitor is thermal overload. In that graph, the dotted line is the upper boundary for thermal overload. If any of your faces, the three colors there, go above the dotted line, you have an overheated line, overheated conductor. As you see in the base case, we already have some overheated conductors in the black portion of the face, the black face, and as you increase the electric vehicle load, that gets worse. But if we do it with distributed energy, none of the faces become overheated. So we have seen that this behavior repeats itself on every one of these feeders that we simulated. Okay? As you increase the electric vehicle, you increase the demand adding electric vehicles to 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% of the demand. Okay, we have more thermal and voltage violations, but we have far less increase in voltage and thermal violation and system losses if we do it with the distributed energy alternative. As we identify the problem, both voltage and thermal problems, we also estimated the cost, the investment needed to solve these problems. And as I show you in this table, if in the base case centralized system, increasing demand due to electric vehicles by 20% will cost you $250 million of investment to face that problem. And if you were to be supplying that energy from distributed energy resources, it will cost you zero. You would need no new investment on distribution to face up to 20% of increased demand from electric vehicles. In the case of going all the way to 40% of electric demand increase due to electric vehicles, you only need to invest 1/10 of the in the improvements of distribution systems. You only need about 41 million in the case of distributed energy resources. You need about 430-some million in the case of the centralized system. So we have seen that this problem is particularly concerning in low voltage feeders and long feeders. And in conclusion, rooftop solar systems with storage are the best alternative in Puerto Rico if we want to increase the electric demand based on electric vehicles. We have seen that this is the alternative that provides more resiliency. We are squarely in the path of hurricanes in the Caribbean. Whenever we have a hurricane, whether it's a strong hurricane like Hurricane Maria or a weak one like Fiona, we spend weeks or months without electricity. The people that have solar rooftop systems don't suffer that. Our homes are mostly built out of concrete, so they provide a steady and strong platform for rooftop solar. So they have this resiliency aspect. They are cheaper. They produce cheaper electricity than the electricity we buy from the grid. We are currently paying between 32 cents and 35 cents per kilowatt hour from unreliable electricity from the grid. About half of that is the cost of using rooftop solar plus storage. And they have the added ability of allowing us to increase the demand from electric vehicles with a lower cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Agustín. I was walking through the New York Customs yesterday, and the person of the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol stopped me and asked me, "What do you have to declare?" And I was reminded of a similar question asked of Oscar Wilde in Victorian England. He said to a similar question, "I have nothing to declare but my genius," as just reminded of that, but I stopped short of saying something similar. And then the next question was, what are you here for? I just said, I am here to speak at a conference, and he asked me what the topic was. I said, distributed energy resources. And he said, he was in a surly mood, and he said, is that even a thing? Okay. I didn't have the gumption to answer that question, and then he stamped my passport and let me through. I represent Vibrant Energy. It's a renewable energy platform based in India, catering to corporate customers. We are backed by the Macquarie Group of Australia. We are India focused, and we have a secured capacity of close to 1 gigawatt of solar and wind, which we own, operate. We design and build these plants and supply clean power, sustainable energy solutions to Indian corporates. What we don't do is we don't supply to utilities. It's baked into the mandate of the platform, and most of our experience has been in serving corporates through distributed energy and also open access third-party plants located across India. A quick overview of the power sector probably is in order. India is the third largest generator of electricity in the world, and the demand has been galloping at a fairly steady clip. Last year's generation was almost 8% higher than the previous years, and it's been the highest since 14-15. Historical power demand has been growing at 4%, and the first quarter of this year has seen an increase of at least 19%. So that there's a fairly strong surge in power demand as the country comes out of the pandemic slowdown. Just to put that thing in perspective, between now and 2030, India needs to add as much capacity as the EU has today. That's the scale of demand we are looking at, and much of it has to come from renewable sources, mostly solar and wind, with some battery storage included. And in this story is the growth of renewables in the broader energy mix that India has today. We are committed, India is committed under COP guidelines and the NDCs of the Paris Declaration to generate at least 50% of its energy through clean energy sources by 2030. We have a net zero goal of net zero emission goal by 2070. When we began in 2010 with the first of the renewable energy capacities being installed today, we set ourselves a target of 175 gigawatts, out of which 100 gigawatts was for solar, 60 gigawatts was for wind. The interesting thing is, out of this 100 gigawatts of solar that we plan to install by end 2022, which is this year, 60% was grid-scale plants and 40% was distributed solar. We've done exceedingly well on the grid-scale front. We, in fact, even before the deadline of December 22, instead of 60 gigawatts target that we had set for, we had already crossed it. It's currently at around 62.5 gigawatts on the grid-scale side. But the performance on the distributed solar side has been fairly dismal. The cumulative capacity that we have today is just about 8 gigawatts compared to the 40 gigawatts that we planned for by end 2022. There are quite a few reasons for that. I'll just go into that. The good part about renewable energy capacity additions is that consistently for the last couple of years, the capacity additions of renewable energy, mostly solar and wind, have outpaced coal capacity additions, and this has happened for the first time ever. India, to all of you who don't know about it, is a very solar resource rich country. We have about 350 sunny days in a year, and it's quite ordinary to have solar plants generating DC PLFs of 18 to 19% across the country. It's slightly more in more solar-rich resource states, but on an average, it's typical to have 18 to 19% capacity utilization factors to any solar plant set up across the country. With typical DC overloading that we have, the plant CUFs can even go up to 30%. From a DER point of view, we are adding about 2 gigawatts of capacity every year, and we just crossed the 8 gigawatt mark. If you look at the DER resources and policies in India, we need to know how this are playing out in a uniquely Indian context. Solar rooftops are the mainstay of the DER bucket we have in India, with significant roles which it plays in agriculture and the commercial industrial sector. 20% of India's energy consumption is for agriculture, and it's heavily subsidized. In most of the states, agricultural power is free, and in the other states where it is not subsidized, with a nil tariff, subsidies can in fact, we charge just about 25% of the commercial tariff to agricultural customers. But the interesting thing about agricultural demand is that it's highly flexible. Because they're getting power virtually free, they're quite okay with timing that availability of supply in a manner that suits the grid. So it's not available 24/7 because it's free. Some states do have 24/7 free agricultural power, but it's mostly rationed. So it is tuned with the harvesting requirements, mainly agricultural pump sets which are used for irrigation. And this is where I think this is a uniquely Indian program, is called the Kusum program, where the idea is to replace virtually all of the diesel-generated agricultural pump sets with solar-based pump sets. And these are the ones which are not grid-connected. And for the ones which are grid-connected, also you have a capital subsidy that can even go up to 30%. The idea is to replace about 10 gigawatts of agricultural load with distributed solar-powered agricultural pump sets. This has had a tremendous response, and the component A of the scheme, which aims at establishing about 10 gigawatts of distributed solar capacity solely focused on the agricultural market, has seen great response. Coming to the C&I sector, it's a pretty warped kind of a situation we have here, and this is also the reason why we have a very low penetration of solar rooftops in India compared to large grid-scale plants. The subsidies for the agricultural sector and also the subsidies for the residential sector, the residential tariffs are also subsidized, is borne by the commercial and industrial sector, which has one of the highest tariffs anywhere in the world. And when it comes to adoption of solar rooftops as DERs, the first segment which was keen to adopt this was the C&I sector, because there was a huge commercial benefit. So solar rooftop tariffs for commercial customers anywhere in India can be 30 to 40% lower than what they're actually paying to the grid. So much of the capacity addition of this 8 gigawatts of rooftop solar that we have seen has been mostly in the C&I space. And the relationship between the utility and the C&I customers as far as it concerns solar rooftops has been fairly adversarial, because for every unit of solar capacity coming up on the roof of a commercial client, it is a lost revenue for the DISCOM, and that revenue actually subsidizes residential and agricultural purposes. And that's the root cause of the hugely adversarial kind of a commercial relationship between distribution utilities and commercial clients and industrial clients wanting to go solar. Despite this, we have had a 50% CAGR growth of rooftop solar between 17 and 21. What we are supposed to achieve by 2022, which is 40 gigawatts, we'll probably be reaching that in the next 4 to 5 years. If you see the bottom left chart, it shows how the solar tariffs, the horizontal line which you see there is the kind of arbitrage you have between residential tariffs, commercial tariffs, and solar. So virtually every residential customer and a commercial customer in India stands to benefit from a purely commercial point of view if he adopts rooftop solar. So you have commercial clients who are wanting to go adopt rooftop solar, but most of the capacity is now going behind the meter, primarily because DISCOMs don't want to extend the typical net metering and gross metering benefits for injecting surplus power into the grid. So typically what's happening today is commercial industrial customers are maximizing the utilization of their rooftop space, putting as much capacity as possible, and making sure that you have no power being injected into the grid during the times when they're not consuming it. So there's a bit of curtailment, there's a bit of wastage, but whatever they get to consume saves them 30 to 40% compared to what they pay to the grid. Going forward, we see at least 6 to 8 gigawatts of capacity being added in the rooftop space, but with much of the capacity going behind the meter, limiting their use as distributed energy resources. It's an unfortunate story, but I think the warped tariffs have to go away, and each sector has to have commercially determined tariffs for this kind of skewed development of the rooftop solar space. Coming to the next bucket, the future looks bright. Like I said, we're going to look at, we'll be crossing 82 gigawatts of solar rooftops by 2030. 6 to 8 gigawatts per annum is what we will be adding every year. The next is battery storage and EVs. We're at a very incipient stage when talking about grid-connected battery storage. We have had a couple of large tenders by utilities so far. That's for pure standalone grid-scale storage. Batteries in the C&I sector and residential sector are still not viable due to very low tariffs and near absence of time-of-day tariffs. The big hope for DERs here is electric vehicles from a grid stability point of view. But given remunerative tariffs and an ancillary market for services, these resources can be harnessed. We have a 27 gigawatt target by 2030, and that's it's helpful as intermittent renewables increase the penetration in the grid. There's a requirement for 27 gigawatts of flexible battery storage. The interesting thing about renewables in India is that all renewables in India, whether it is solar, wind, waste, energy from waste, or for any other matter, for biomass, they have a must-run status, which means that the entire generation has to be taken into the grid. So whenever there's a surplus from our resources, we generally tend to back down coal. This has resulted in a situation where the coal capacity utilization every year has been declining. 5 years back, if you were to look at typical plant load factors of coal plants in India, it used to be in the 85 to 90% range. That has now come down to 55 to 60%. Now, this is not priced because the fixed cost of running coal plants is not really factored in. So it's a kind of an indirect subsidy that renewables enjoys in India. But one thing that has helped us is the coal has been acting as a kind of a balancing factor, reducing the dependency on more flexible resources like batteries and pumped storage and DERs. So we tend to shut down coal or ramp down coal whenever there's a spurt in renewable energy generation. The third bucket is demand response. We have quite a few utilities which have time-of-day tariffs, which tend to charge commercial clients higher tariffs during the peak demand hours on the grid. But other than that, we really not been able to go beyond time-of-day tariffs because the residential sector is heavily subsidized, very sensitive to power tariffs, and agricultural sector is largely getting access to free power. But as we go forward, there's an increasing need for a demand response measure in terms of variable pricing, and markets really have been only just about 5% of India's total energy gets traded on the markets, and most of it is under bilateral PPA contracts between sellers and buyers. We're going to see much more of the energy getting traded on the markets, and demand response in that kind of scenario is going to play a very significant role in times to come. Growth potential, I've just tried to capture growth potential. Rooftop solar shows a lot of promise. It's going to be from an 8 gigawatt market today to at least 150 to 160 gigawatts by 2040. Battery energy storage will be a 200 gigawatt market by 2040. Mobility between 67 to 168 gigawatts. Demand response and microgrids are trailing and are the least contributors for the growth potential of DRs in India. Concluding, we continue to be an energy deficit country. Deficits have been decreasing, but is still energy deficit country. India has installed only half of what renewable energy capacity has planned. It's currently at 43% renewables in the energy mix. The target for 2018 will be only met next year. India has an ambitious target of 500 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. DRs are going to play a very, very significant role going forward. But the key to making that happen is to restore the financial health of DISCOMs and also foreign funding. The requirement for investment in renewables in India is close to, this was around 116 trillion in the next 5 years. So it's talking about at least 30 trillion every year. At least 11 trillion US dollars per year. Foreign funding, financial health of the DISCOMs are key. And on that note, I will conclude. Thanks to IEEFA for having me here. Thank you.
I hope that you have lots of questions too, and we will get some mics up. But I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask the first couple of questions. Firstly, to Cathy and Agustín on Puerto Rico, obviously very, very challenging situation. Agustín, your analysis is on existing feeders, and it looked like there's quite an extensive grid throughout the region. Is there anyone looking at microgrids for greater resilience, and how does that fit into the picture from your point of view?
We have a microgrid laboratory at the Universidad de Puerto Rico, where I work for. We are 9 electric power system professors in my school, which is a very large group. Probably we are among the largest power system groups in the United States. And we have specialists in microgrids, Fabio Andrade, and he built this laboratory, and most of us, about 6 professors, work out of this lab. So we are currently in the process of installing a microgrid in Maricao, which is an area that was greatly affected by Hurricane Maria. It's a town in the center of the island. We already built a small microgrid in Castañer, another mountainous area town. There are, I'll say, about 3 or 4 microgrids working, community microgrids working in Puerto Rico right now. During Hurricane Fiona, the one we already built in Castañer worked fine. I mean, these people were very satisfied with the performance of the microgrid. So yes, the answer is yes, we are working toward the deployment of microgrids. And microgrids should have the effect of reducing the price and allowing more people to use rooftop solar. For instance, in Maricao, we have seen there is a clinic that already has solar panels. So if they want to increase their use of PV, they have to rely on the rooftop of their neighbors. Otherwise, so if we don't interconnect them, they cannot grow in their use of solar PV, which they are very happy with the ones they have. So we have designed this microgrid to take advantage of that. We're in that process, so you invite me next year and we'll talk about it again.
Cathy, do you want to comment from your perspective? No? Okay. Vinay, I think probably a lot of people here will be fascinated to hear about the 2- and 3-wheelers which dominate electric vehicle sales in India. And you mentioned in your presentation that the infrastructure, or the technical or the regulatory circumstances are not in place yet for vehicle to grid. But by the sound of things, people are thinking about vehicle to grid or vehicle to home with these 2- and 3-wheelers. Obviously that's smaller capacity, but then you've potentially got smaller electricity demand in homes compared with in places like Australia and the US. How are you thinking about electric vehicles as batteries on wheels in the Indian context?
Yeah, So many of the Indian states have decided the tariffs for charging power for electric vehicles, and that typically tends to be in the range of 6 to 7 rupees a unit, which is about 7 cents, $7 cents per kilowatt hour. Most of the EV base is actually two-wheelers in India and is growing at almost 116% every year. 97% of India's fuel requirements are imported. So from an energy security point of view, promoting growth and catalyzing growth of the automobile sector is of prime eminence. And it's there in the policy. So we have a fairly enabling policy on promoting the growth of EVs. But from a grid integration point of view, we are yet to come out with vehicle-to-grid standards. The reason for that is to make injection of electricity from a vehicle to the grid, you need to compensate vehicle owners at least at not less than 10 to 12 rupees a unit, and that's 10 to 12 US cents a kilowatt hour. And discoms are not in a position to pay that kind of a price to vehicle owners to make it viable for them to inject power into the grid. They find it far more easier. Like I said, renewables are having a must-run status, so they ramp down other thermal and non-fossil fuel sources. So ramp down coal plants to meet the kind of flexibility requirements that the grid requires. So there are other ways of doing it. Pricing, demand response, and ramping down coal are the popular methods, and not really buying battery power from vehicles connected to the grid. Even the vehicle owners, commercial aspects aside, batteries have a limited number of cycles. It's not more than 3,000 to 3,500 cycles, which is the life of the battery. And they would rather preserve that for actually driving than injecting power to the grid, unless the economics is so compelling that it more than compensates for the lost life of the battery.
Thanks. Cathy, you spoke right at the beginning about obviously the very difficult financial circumstances in Puerto Rico with the privatisation, the lack of federal government support, obviously, on top of all of the consequences of the climate-related disasters. From your not-for-profit's perspective, what do you see are the most important things that need to be done to help create, there's probably a half an hour answer to this question, but to really ensure that there can be not only a resilient but also an affordable set of infrastructure going forward for Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I referenced in the presentation a modeling study that we published last year looking at achieving 75% renewable energy, specifically rooftop solar and storage in Puerto Rico within the next 15 years. And I think that would address the transformation that you're talking about, and specifically if about 9.6 billion of the federal funds that are available were directed towards that transformation. The analysis showed that we could reduce rates in Puerto Rico to about 15 cents per kilowatt hour, which is about half of where they're at currently. So in terms of the affordability, that would be transitioning towards rooftop solar and a decentralized system is critical, because right now Puerto Rico gets more than 95% of its electricity from fossil fuels, and that's obviously the rising cost of oil and natural gas over the last year is what's driven rates through the roof in Puerto Rico and just continues to provoke ongoing volatility and financial dysfunction within the electrical system. And another part of the answer to your question is also dealing with the $8 to $9 billion of legacy debt of Puerto Rico's electrical system, which Tom mentioned earlier in the plenary. But the current idea of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico of raising rates even further to pay back that debt is simply not feasible in Puerto Rico. And so dealing with the debt crisis in a way that does not impose basically unpayable costs on the economy of Puerto Rico is essential as well.
So that sounds very much like what Sarah Jane was talking about in the last section. So is it simply a matter of political will, or are there other barriers to that change happening?
I think it's a matter of political will, but complicated by the territorial status of Puerto Rico, because the Financial Oversight and Management Board is not accountable to the government or the people of Puerto Rico.
Okay. We have a microphone, 2 microphones. Please, if anyone has a question, please make your way to the microphone. And obviously introduce yourself before you ask your question. I'll take the gentleman on my left first.
Thank you. Thank you for the great discussion. My question, okay. My name is Dhruba. I'm from India. I work for Climate Policy Initiative. My question is, Vinay has already given a great picture as far as India's distributed renewable energy is concerned. But it brings me to one question, which possibly is both economic, political, and technical, is when we look at DRE, and it's not probably country specific, but we seem to come across this adversarial relationship, as Vinay calls it, and also in Australia, you said about taking away utilities lunch. Now, it both tells me that there is some sort of, and I think Australia had provided some examples of what the world then called it grid defection. So if, and the issue is very clear in the sense, the more renewable distributed rooftop solar, you're taking away the utilities lunch, or you're probably creating a situation which is unsustainable on a long run because utilities financial position and their need to cross-subsidize. So what I'm thinking here is, and I need, my request is for a response, is there a way that one could converge these together? Now, technology storage allows you to go behind the meter. There is a policy for net metering, which then, and by the way, in India, your policies might be there, but actually policy and implementation have a wide divergence. So the policies might look good on paper, but then when you get to implementation, that's not available. Now, the key to this is, if technology and markets are pushing forward, as Agustín showed in terms of even to the extent of adding DRE is creating better stability in the grid, where is the convergence possible between the utility and the DRE? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I'll start and then hand over to Vinay. I didn't mean to imply there's an adversarial relationship between the small scale and the large scale. It just so happens that the stage of the energy transition that Australia is at, the rooftop solar has been eating into the profitability. This is a good problem to have. Essentially, where we're at in Australia at the moment, at significant proportions of the year, we're seeing negative prices now in the middle of the day. So you can get paid to use electricity. As soon as you get a significant number of electric vehicles and they are charged in the middle of the day, that will soak up that available supply. And it also just implies we haven't got sophisticated enough in terms of our flexible demand. The other way in which we could soak up all of that abundant solar in the middle of the day is through electrification. So Australia still has a very high proportion of households that are on gas, particularly in Victoria and South Australia. That's for heating and cooking and hot water. And we need to make sure that we get those households off gas as fast as possible, and that hot water is electrified in a smart way, so that instead of heating in the middle of the night with coal-fired generation, as has been done in the past, that's using the solar in the middle of the day. So I think it's a point in time issue that we can solve with smarter load management. The other way to solve it together with the load management is obviously getting the remaining coal in the Australian system out as quickly as possible. Vinay.
Right, I think we have kind of painted ourselves into a corner when we look at this adversarial relationship between the discoms and the commercial and industrial customers who are the prime movers for distributed solar in India, to a point where there is virtually no intelligent debate happening on the subject. But I think the key to resolving this and scaling growth in the sector is to look at what discoms are losing in the process, the revenue that they lose, compensate them for the cross-subsidy surcharge that they lose, compensate them for the grid support services that they extend to distributed solar, price them in a manner that is fair. The regulators have to step in for that. And I believe that even after doing all this, the sector has enough of a price arbitrage to continue to go solar. Though it is much lesser than what it is today without this, but you would still have an advantage without the adversarial relationship if these costs are priced in from a discom point of view. And unless the discoms' concerns are addressed, we'll remain stuck where we are. And that's important, not just for customers, but also for generators in the space. Now, today, we have a very popular saying in India, how do you make a small pile of money in distributed solar? And the sarcastic answer for that is start with a bigger pile of money. It doesn't have to remain that way, and there are solutions, but these are more commercial than technical in nature. And I'm sure we'll get around to that. There's increasing realization that there are advantages to the discom that have to be priced in. The lesser investment in T&D infrastructure, better utilization of the last mile in the power network. And from a purely agricultural point of view, moving generation closer to the consumption point has definite advantages. So if you're going to lose 7 rupees per unit by supplying power free to the agricultural sector, it makes much more sense to have distributed resources closer to the demand so that you don't incur all the costs of the network, the losses, and then still lose money in supplying power free. There's a compelling investment proposition for discoms to lose lesser money by moving distributed generation closer to the agricultural customer. That's something that we have really not explored. So there are many options. Commercial problems are usually more easy to solve than technical problems. And I'm sure the regulators, the industry will find a way.
There was a gentleman here in the striped shirt.
Hi, thanks. It's a question, Gabrielle, but I wonder if anyone else might want to chip in as well. It's great to use Australia as an example of this because Australia is going faster than so anyone else or anywhere else in the world. So great PowerPoint slides to learn the good stuff and the bad stuff, and I'm hoping you're kind of traveling the world 24/7, showing all sorts of people because there's so many people that I think could learn from them. From the way that you presented it, it's kind of possible to see, what happens as rooftop solar gets built up in the next year or 2 or 3 years. But starting from the other side, like the end goal of 100% clean power, if you look at within the US, there's the kind of pledge for 2035 clean power. In the UK, in Germany, in Canada, there's pledges for 2035 clean power. We're only 13 years away from that now. It's getting closer, and we're kind of working through it in our head of what needs to happen. But I wondered, just from your perspective, what role rooftop solar can play in that end game. Like, how much can it actually deliver as a total amount of electricity, and how does it match up with the demand? So when you look through the not just the 24-hour period, but across a week, a month, a season, when you talk about electrifying the rest of the sector as electricity demand grows, and you're building heat pumps and everything else, how can rooftop solar need that, and what else does it need from the grid to be able to get towards 100% clean power? Obviously, in the case of Australia, you don't have kind of legacy nuclear. There's not that much hydro there. Most of the other generation is coal and gas. So some wind there, which will continue to build up. But as the coal and gas start shutting, how much can you rely on distributed solar alone? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think the short answer is you can't rely on distributed solar alone. It's obviously a really important part of the picture, but as we move to all of these weather and climate dependent renewables, that's where we really need the flexible demand to match it, because we're essentially flipping the electricity system, right? We used to have steady as she goes coal, and then we would ramp up gas to meet demand. Now we have supply that varies by time of day and by the nature of the wind, and then we need demand to flex to match the available supply. That's not easy to do, and that's why, for example, in the middle of the day we're seeing a lot of those negative prices. But South Australia is really the foremost part of Australia in terms of going forward and getting rid of coal and using rooftop solar. So over the last year, South Australia has overall produced 68% of its electricity supply from renewables. 14 years ago, it had zero renewables, so it's gone from 0 to 14% renewables, 0 to 68% renewables in 14, 15 years. And there are large parts of South Australia where there's 50, 60, 70, 100% of households in a particular suburb have rooftop solar. And there is now no coal in the South Australian grid. So what's not renewable is simply gas and traded electricity with Victoria. So you can get a very, very long way with a lot of rooftop solar, but it is, as I said at the beginning, it's everything, everywhere, all at once. In terms of where Australia's going and how fast, after 9 years of Conservative government, where we essentially stalled in terms of proactive national government policy, we had a change of government recently, and the federal government has a target of 43% emissions reduction by 2030 and 82% renewables by 2030. The movement's goal is to ensure that all coal is out of the Australian East Coast national electricity market by 2030. That would give you more like 96% renewables by 2030. It's a stretch goal, but it's close to doable. We've seen enormous state government support, and probably the big thing, to give you one thing to link on that's happened in the past year, is offshore wind has come into play in the Australian energy transformation in a way that hasn't before. So we've had legislation passed to set the regulation in place to make it possible, and that in the state of Victoria, the ocean south there is Bass Strait, that has some of the strongest, most consistent winds anywhere in the world. It's kind of like the North Sea. There's also good wind resources in New South Wales and in Queensland. And what gives me a lot of optimism is the fact that that offshore wind will be so consistent. We're talking like 60, 70% capacity factors, and through the night, and at times where we will need a lot of storage in the grid, but we will also hopefully within the next decade have a huge amount of offshore wind that will be providing far more continuous supply, and then obviously rooftop solar plus flexible demand. I know we're out of time. Did anyone else have a burning question? Yes, go for it.
The first question is regarding the metaling method. There are two methods. The German style is there are 2 meters or sub-meters, generation meter and load meters. So utilities, government, policymakers know exactly the data for how much the PV produce energy. And in Japan, or most of their states in North America, UK, they are net just 1 meters. So PV generation minus self-consumption is the data, only data. So we have no way to know exactly what percentage was self-consumed. And for the same things for the EV consumption, In some utilities in California or UKs, like Octopus or OVO, they have sub-meters. So their load for EV charging and load for others can be separately measured. I guess in South Australia or other states in Australia, it's a German way, right? And how about India and Puerto Rico? Two-way meters or just 1 meters?
Thanks for the question. If I understand it correctly, what happens in Australia is that whenever you install a household PV system, then you get a smart meter. But otherwise, most of the metering in Australia is, unfortunately, old analog dumb meters. And so we have very poor behind the meter data generally. The question you ask about different types of meters, particularly for EVs and the like, is a live regulatory question at the moment. There have been 2 models discussed by the regulator about whether or not you would require basically another revenue grade meter for behind the meter loads like EVs, or whether you would have parent-child kind of metering relationships, and that hasn't been worked out. And that's one of the areas where really the regulation is lagging a long way behind where it needs to be in terms of working out these issues. We have, like Puerto Rico, we've only got 4% of vehicles sold in Australia at the moment are electric vehicles, but really we're not planning for them from a technical and regulatory perspective as quickly as we should be. There was a question for India as well.
This is a huge debate in India about the kind of metering that distributed rooftop clients can have. And depending on which party's perspective you look at it from, there's a preferred way of metering. From the customer point of view, obviously they would want net metering with a single meter logging all the export and the import. And typically the DISCOM has to pay for the customer's export of power to the grid in some form. The DISCOMs, on the other hand, want 2 separate meters, completely isolated circuits for the generation part and the consumption part. And it's called gross metering in India, and they just pay for the generation circuit, which is a standalone circuit. Okay, so we began with most of the states offering net metering to all kinds of clients, but slowly we discussed about the adversarial relationship. DISCOMs have been withdrawing net metering benefits from high-paying clients like commercial clients. It remains today, residential clients still are allowed net metering, and the threshold loads which are entitled for net metering have been reduced from over a period of time. So, broadly speaking, it's net metered single meters for residential customers going forward, and DISCOMs gross metering 2 separate circuits, 2 meters for commercial clients. That's how we see it evolving in India.
We do have net metering in Puerto Rico, and we use a single meter for residential and commercial applications. There have been some talk about having a separate meter. At some point, the Junta de Controles Fiscal, the Fiscal Oversight Board, proposed a solar tax, and there was talk about having a second meter on your premises to find out how much electricity you're producing. That was quickly shut down. I mean, people started protesting, and it has not come up again. But we currently only have 1 meter.
Thank you. I noticed some people are already desperately leaving for a cup of tea or coffee. I'd very much like to thank Vinay, Agustín, Cathy for... Thank you for your attention and excellent questions.
And thank you, Gabrielle, for moderating the
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for attending. Our next session begins at 4:30.